Hi! Carousels in UI can be used for a wide range of use cases. I initially thought about event reminders for games like holidays or special time-limited events. But my community had other ideas as well, like using them for old-school cutscenes, character creation, or customization systems. So let's tackle this versatile element in this tutorial. This is how it's going to be set up. We have a parent object holding the carousel itself and two optional text boxes. The player can control via button click or swipe when to jump to the next entry, or we can set it to an auto move after a set amount of time. At the bottom, indicators will display at which position in the carousel we are currently located. The entries to our carousel themselves will be handled with scriptable objects, so that we can easily create those in the inspector and later mix and match as needed. If you need scrollable text boxes instead, watch my tutorial on how to create those instead. You will find the link to the GitHub project in the video description. There you will also be able to download the indicator graphics in case you don't have any. Let's get started. Begin in the inspector and create a new UI scroll view. Remove the two scroll bars as we won't be needing them. In the scroll rect component, mark it as moving horizontally only and the movement type to clamp. I'll explain in a moment why. We disable the inertia and set our scroll sensitivity to 0. Because we do this, the player won't be able to just scroll to the left or right inside our scroll view. Your two boxes for the scroll bars are set to none, that is correct. In your viewport, set the value for bottom in the rect transform to 0. This is a remnant of a scroll bar located at that position. The rest can stay as it is. If you want your carousel to have a different shape than rectangular, you can use an image of that shape in this object's image component. Opening up the viewport, we find the content area. This is where your images will sit. We need a horizontal layout group, which we can keep at the initial setup values. But to be able to scroll correctly inside our contents, we also need a content size fitter. Set it to horizontal preferred and vertical unconstrained. So, create a new image inside this content to see how this all works up to here. The default image will be 100 by 100 pixel in size. My example carousel is 600 pixel by 300 pixel, and all the images I'm going to create for this are 600 by 300 as well. If you need multiple carousels, just create the initial one first and then create duplicates of its prefab later with the new or added sizes you need. Set the initial size of the image to these values as well. Rename it and drag it to your project folder to prefab it. Then duplicate the image 2 or 3 times so we can test things. Recolor the duplicates to make changes more visible. One thing you should already see happening when you create more copies is that the contents outline grows to the right. This is important so that we can actually swipe through the entries. Let's enter play mode. We can click and drag through the entries. In our final carousel, we don't want this to happen though. The carousel shouldn't stay stuck between two entries, for example. Also, we set the movement type to clamped in our scroll rect. While in play mode, switch those over to unrestricted and elastic to see how that behaves. Clamped will make sure the player will only ever be able to see the entries, not overshoot the movement. To make sure our images won't get stretched or squashed to fill the box, drag any sprite you have into the image component and check Preserve Aspect. You can then delete the image again. The component will remember the setting. In the prefab dropdown at the top, apply all overrides. Remove the images from the hierarchy. We will have code handle those going forward. Next up are the two buttons to move the carousel. Create them as children to the scroll view by right-clicking UI button Text Mesh Pro. For the left button, hold Alt and Shift and first click on this area, then click on Stretch Left. This will anchor your button, so that when you change the size of your carousel, the button will stay at the side with a fixed width. I set mine to 100 pixel. Pick the right button and Alt-Shift click again here, choosing Anchor to stretch right. Then change its width too. Now both buttons will stick to the side no matter the size. If you're not yet familiar with anchors, I highly recommend you go and watch my tutorial on how those work after this tutorial is done. It makes creating UI a whole lot easier. I set both buttons graphics to the Unity built-in rectangle and changed the color to dark gray with a bit of transparency. If you want to display arrows, you can find good ones to use at fonts.google.com under the Icons tab. That's a huge resource and I highly recommend you keep that on your radar. These arrows are under Next and Previous. Make sure to pick the iOS ones both times, or your left arrow will sit strangely offset compared to the right. Also, you can set the color you need these icons in. All F is white. Remove the text boxes and switch them over to images. Drag the corresponding arrows into them and change their sizes as needed. 50 pixels looks good enough for me. The last part of the inspector setup is creating two text boxes. One for a headline and one for the descriptive text. And a button that will lead to wherever our entries want to steer the player. We will be setting the text and on-click action by script later. Style your text boxes any way you want. I'm giving mine a different font and the headline gets colored in green to stand out more. In case you are using a bold font for any of this, like I do for the headline and for the button text, I recommend you increase the character and word spacing slightly like I do here. It makes bold fonts typically a little easier to read. Select them and right-click to create a new empty parent object to group them together. If buttons are new to you, you might want to watch my tutorial on how to create those. Make sure your carousel is set to 000 for its rect transform and the text and buttons are located wherever you want them in relation to that. Then select all elements and right-click choose Create Empty Parent. This will group them all under one easy-to-reuse game object. Give it a name and prefab it. The core setup being done, we will tackle the 5 scripts we need next. The first one is for our entry and a scriptable object. Another is for text boxes. Yet another handles the behavior of those little indicators. One is for the manager for the carousel itself, which will work with a varying amount of entries, and one is for our next and previous buttons to have a bit of fading in and out. If you don't know what scriptable objects are yet, don't worry, you'll understand along the way. We start with the entry. Instead of this being a mono behavior, replace it with scriptable object. We want to be able to create these by right-clicking into our project and picking them from the context menu. To be able to do so, we need this long attribute above the class itself. File name is the default name a new object of this type will be called. Menu name is the entry under which we will be able to find it. In my case, I put it under UI/carousel entry. This will create a custom UI folder at the top of the context menu with one entry for the, well, you guessed it, carousel entry. Order 0 will handle at which position in that submenu this entry will be located, so seeing as we won't add any more, this really isn't doing a whole lot. The rest is rather simple. We need a graphic for our entry. Next come fields for the headline and the description. Description gets the multi-line attribute, so that we can actually see all the text we want to fill the box with. Next is a method that should be called when this entry has been chosen. I'll call the method interact and have it load a level of a certain name. That's all we need for the entry. Go to your project folder, right-click and create a few entries for the carousel so we can test them later. Our two text boxes will also get a little action, two different modes. Immediate display of infos and one that fades out old infos and fades in again with new. Create a new script called Carousel Text Box. It will get a reference to the TMP text fields for headline and description. We want to be able to choose whether we want the text to fade or not, and if so, we need a fade duration, which we will set by the manager later. To easily fade the old text out and the new text in, we are going to set the text once it's been faded out completely, so we also need to know the halfway point of the entire fade duration. So we need a way to store that as well. We start with a method to set the text without any fade, for which we hand over the headline and description text and set our text boxes to the entries. To use fade, we will also give the fade duration and check if fade text is false. In that case, we just default back to our first method. If we actually want to fade, we need to check if we already have a coroutine running, in which case we need to stop it. We set the fade duration and start a new coroutine of the method fadeText like this. The next method looks a little verbose, but it's basically doing a similar thing twice. It fades out the alpha of the text boxes over the duration of half the runtime, then it updates it with the new infos. Then it resets the time and fades the alpha in again. Lastly, we need to make sure we end up with a 1 in alpha. Due to how floats and time work, this could otherwise be off by a small amount. Attach this script in the inspector to the parent of our text boxes. Having the dark boxes of our next and previous buttons overlaying on top of our entries will look strange. Instead, we want to implement a way that will fade them in to indicate the clickable areas and fade out again once the mouse cursor leaves. Create a new script for this and call it Carousel Buttons. We need to implement two interfaces for this, iPointerEnter handler and iPointerExit handler. These are two so-called interfaces, which will give a way for our object to interact with the pointer, a mouse in many cases. Similar to our previous text example, we need a duration, which we will be able to set in the inspector this time, a reference to our buttons, and a coroutine to store the fading in. We set the color of our background in the image component, but since this is a button, hovering, selecting and clicking would change this depending on the values you set up here. We could set them to the same value we set in the image itself by hand, but that's not particularly fun. Create an onValidate method. These get called only in the inspector and only whenever you change a value there. We go look for the button and image components we should be sure about already being on our object. If they are null, we will set values to them by code. These next lines will feel familiar if you've seen my button tutorial. We check if our transition is set to color tint, which it should be at this point. But if it's not, we won't do anything. We grab the color block, which is this part of the button component, and set each entry to the same color of our button background. It might be useful in the inspector to see the half-transparent areas to fine-tune the width of the button, but initially we don't want those to show up in the game. This is why we set the alpha value to fully transparent and start. OnPointerEnter and OnPointerExit are the two methods we need to implement to using the two interfaces. They both need some pointer event data, which would provide a whole lot more infos about what is interacting, but we don't need to use this for our use case. Still, it needs to be provided. Both classes check if a routine is already running and stop it. If we don't have this, we would run into unintended behaviors, which are a bit rough to figure out later. Then we start a new routine, fading alpha to 1 in enter and to 0 on exit. The routine itself takes the desired alpha value and duration, takes the initial alpha value and sets the time to 0. Then it runs another while loop just like we did before, incrementing the time, calculating the lerp value, which checks how transparent the image should be at this point, grabbing the color from the button background and setting its new value to the lerp value between start and target alpha. Then it assigns the color back to the button background. Yield return null, waits for a frame, then the loop will do its thing once more. Assign this code to both buttons and link the correct image to their fields. And don't forget to give it a test in play mode. Onwards to the indicator. That will be the small group of circles filling and emptying at the bottom to show where inside the carousel the player is located. The amount of circles needed will be determined at runtime and correspond to the amount of entries. In the inspector, create a new game object as a child to the viewport. Alt-Shift-click on the anchor menu and choose Stretch on bottom side. Its height should be around 20 pixels. This needs to have a horizontal layout group attached with a bit of spacing between our elements, and the alignment needs to be set to center. All the other check marks should be turned off. Inside, create a new object called Carousel Indicator. To make sure it's not somehow cut off at the edges, I made mine slightly smaller than the box it sits in. 15 pixels is fine, and since it's supposed to be a circle, both width and height get set to that value. Create two image child components. The first is the filling of the circle. The second is the outline. I colored the fill sprite in yellow, so the effect is easy to identify later. Add the button component to the empty indicator and set its transition mode to none. We want to be able to click on those to jump to the according entry in the carousel. If you duplicate the indicator, you should be able to see them popping up in the center of our indicator container. If they don't, make sure you set the alignment up correctly in the horizontal layout group from a moment ago. Remove all but one from the hierarchy once you checked all alignments. We want the indicators to light up one after the other depending on which entry we are on. This needs a little bit of code again. This is going to be very similar to what we did with the buttons, just that this time we won't be using onPointerEnter or PointerExit. We need a reference to our image, which we will tell Unity to get in reset. We also need yet another coroutine reference. We need two methods to handle the clicking and jumping to the corresponding entry. First, we need a method to initialize our button with a method. This might look a little strange if you haven't seen it before. Our parameter is an action, basically a method we hand over instead of just a value. Then we go to the button component of our indicator and add a new listener to onClick, which basically means the button will call this method when it has been clicked. Whenever we add a listener, we need to remove it too. So in onDestroy, which gets called when the object it sits on gets destroyed, we remove the listener in a similar way. In Activate, we stop a potentially running routine and start a new one fading alpha to 1. In Deactivate, we do the exact same but fade to 0 instead. Change alpha takes the initial alpha value, sets time to 0 and changes the opacity just like we did with our buttons over a set duration of time. This time will be set through the manager so that our indicators and the time we transition from one image to the next for our entries will be the same. Add the script to the indicator and prefab it. Then remove it from the hierarchy. Seeing the length of this tutorial, you've probably been sitting here for longer than 20 minutes. Maybe go and grab another drink and stretch for a moment. While you're at it, if you liked the video, please give it a like and consider subscribing for more Unity UI tutorials. And thank you for doing so. Seeing people enjoy my videos is why I continue to create them. Especially monsters like this one. Okay, so we can now finally tie all of that together in our carousel script. Make sure to add the iAndDrag handler to it. That's yet another interface. It will enable us to control what should happen if the player doesn't use the buttons and instead just swipes inside our carousel box itself. We start with the setup of all the values and references we need. A list of entries this carousel should display. Due to our entries being things we can set up, add and remove, this will make our carousel be very modular. We need references to the scroll rect of the carousel and the content box. We also need references to the entry prefab. This was the image we initially set up. Depending on the amount of entries, we will instantiate the required amount of those prefabs and start. We will store them in images for entries. Indicators will work the same. The parent object into which we are going to instantiate them, a reference to the prefab, and a list of where we store the references. In animation setup, we will declare the time swiping from one image to the next will take and the easing method. Easing handles if your transition will speed up, slow down, or be constant, for example. I would advise to not have longer transition periods than a second, as carousels like this are typically there to hand out infos and nobody likes waiting on those. But a second will give a good amount of time to check the differences between easing curves if you're not yet used to them. We will include a way for our carousel, this word is starting to lose all meaning to me by now, to swipe automatically to the next entry. For that we need a check and an interval for that to happen. In Info Setup, we link up the text box controller as well as a button for our call to action. Lastly, we need the current index we are sitting at, and once again yet another coroutine. We can have Unity get the scroll rect and carousel text box in reset, but we'll have to set up other references in the inspector later. There's a high chance it will get the wrong button and transforms, for example, if we do it automatically like this. Welcome to the start method. For each entry in our list, we will instantiate a copy of our entry prefab into the content box. We get the image and set its sprite to whatever we set up in our entry scriptable object. Then we add it to the list of images for the entry. Indicators are even a little bit simpler. We just need to instantiate and parent them correctly and add them to the list of indicators. We are going to have a method in a moment that lets us scroll to a specific index. This will be the index of our entry. Lastly, we turn on the first indicator of the list like this. We will call one method whenever we are going to change our currently displayed entry. Clear current index. First, we will deactivate the indicator for the entry we are currently on. Then we will remove the listener from the call to action button, which would call the interact method on that entry. This is important because otherwise we would constantly add to the list of methods, which would be called when the button gets clicked. Scroll to specific index will do just that. We clear the index first, then scroll to the chosen one. Scroll to next and scroll to previous are both public and work almost the same, just that they calculate the next or previous index to scroll to. By using the modulo, we basically make this wrap around again so that our value is never out of range of the amount of entries we have in our list. Scroll to takes an index and assigns it to the current one. We need to calculate the target horizontal position so that our images are centered in the carousel box. In case our carousel is already turning, we stop the motion and start a new one. We can grab the headline and description like this and send it to our text box controller. The duration we assign is the time we pick to move from one entry to the next. Then we activate the now active entries indicator and add the listener to that entry's interact method. 3 more methods to go. Lerp to position takes the target position of our entry and initializes the elapsed time and initial position. During the while loop, which will run until the duration is over, it checks for the position inside the easing curve. This will handle how the animation inside the carousel speeds up or slows down, and we are going to take that position to calculate the new position for the animation. We'll increment the elapsed time and wait for a frame through yield return null, after which the loop will start again. Lastly, as we did before, we need to set the horizontal position manually like this to make sure time and floats didn't abandon our entry shortly before or past the goal. This is all we need for clicking on indicators and the next and previous button, but we have 2 small things yet to solve. Automatically sliding through the carousel and making sure that the player can't drag or swipe to some place between 2 entries. The autoscroll happens during a quick and simple update. If we don't want to use it, we don't. Otherwise, we subtract delta time from the autoscroll timer, and if it is below 0, we will scroll to the next entry. Then we just need to reset the initial value of our timer. Not getting stuck between 2 entries is getting handled in onEndDrag, which gets called whenever a drag event ended. Data gives us infos about the kind of input that was received. We want to check if its delta, that is the distance recorded between click and release for example, is not 0. We want to either scroll to the next or to the previous one accordingly. In case the delta is 0, we will scroll to the current index, which will look like nothing happened to the user. That was quite a bit of code. Thank you for staying for so long. Let's set up the last few things in the inspector. Drag the script onto the carousel parent and fill out the empty fields with the required entries. I'll leave my setup on screen for a moment here in case you want a copy. For the ease curve, click on it and choose anything that goes up from the left. Click on the small lock at the top and drag and drop your entries into the list. In case you still have any prefabs in your hierarchy, make sure to apply any changes you might have made to them and remove them afterwards. Also make sure to hook up the correct methods to the previous and next buttons. Click play. If everything worked out alright, which I hope it does, you should now be able to scroll through your carousel. Yay! What are you going to use it for? Let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed my tutorial. I hadn't expected it to turn out this long, but even things like a carousel consist of many small parts one barely takes notice of. Have a great week!